Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Final Curtsey, a royal memoir by the Queen's cousin, by Margaret Rhodes, narrated by Jennifer M. Dixon. Foreword. People have told me that I have become a publishing sensation, which I take with a large pinch of salt. Frankly, I'm amazed that so many people have become interested in my life and times, and I firmly believe that all they really wanted to hear about is how two extraordinary people made such an impact on my rather ordinary existence, and by doing so made me seem a touch extraordinary myself. I refer, of course, to my charismatic aunt, the late Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and my first cousin, the Queen, who in her Diamond Jubilee year is receiving the plaudits of the nation. Without them, this book would have been as nothing. The book also coincided with the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton, and a time of interest in and support for all the royal family. The writing of this memoir started more years ago than I care to remember, simply as an account of my life to entertain my children and grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. Over the years, one or two of my family told me there could be a book in this, Mum. I have to say I never believed them, but still added a few more pages to the yellowing pile beside my old-fashioned typewriter. Much more recently, other people urged me to go public, believing that my story punctuates social history as I have lived it. I began, against my better judgment, the round of literary agents and publishers, being regularly rebuffed. It seemed that I was not in fashion, and I was often told, "It would be so easy if you were famous, like the wife of a footballer." But finally, Umbria Press, to my delight, took the book on, and those who turned me down have been proved wrong, while my family and supporters, against the odds, have been proved right. Suddenly I really was a celebrity, with the book being serialized in the Mail on Sunday, and hello, it reached number 1 in the Sunday Times bestseller list and has sold nearly 30,000 copies, 10 times the first printing of 3,000 copies. I have been shuttled between newspaper and magazine offices, television and radio studios to be interviewed about what I was doing in, say, 1937 or 1945. The media, it seems, like living history, even an ancient monument like me. One reviewer had the cheek to suggest a preservation order should be slapped on me. Surely I'm not that ancient. I've been very flattered by the reviews, but the one I particularly liked remarked that my little book read as if a hostess were offering a string of amusing anecdotes to her dinner guests. That rather summed up my efforts, as I enormously enjoy entertaining and having people about me. It seems that I have caught the imagination of the book-reading public, and so the dinner party has turned into a rather large occasion. What else can I say, other than thank you so much for coming? Chapter 1. The Final Curtsey. Saturday the 30th of March 2002 will be etched in my memory forever, although it started like any other day at the Garden House, my home in the Royal Enclave in Windsor Great Park, which had been granted to me by my first cousin, the Queen, 22 years earlier. At that time, my husband, Dennis, had become seriously ill, and we thought it sensible to move from our isolated house on the edge of Dartmoor. The problem had been finding somewhere suitable and affordable. There was not a great deal of money in hand, and therefore I shall never forget the morning when my prayers were answered. I was out riding with the Queen on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, and she suddenly turned in the saddle and said, "Could you bear to live in suburbia?" It transpired that she was offering us a house in the great park at Windsor, the previous occupant of which had been the great horticulturist and landscaper, Sir Eric Savile, the former director of the gardens in the Great Park and architect of the famous Savile and Valley Gardens, which are close by. Our new home was a short drive from the castle and almost round the corner from Royal Lodge, the weekend retreat of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who was my mother's youngest sister and my aunt. Royal Lodge had been her country retreat since 1932, after King George V gave it to his second son, then the Duke of York and his Duchess. This house was very special as far as Queen Elizabeth was concerned, and she left her mark upon it. Together with her husband she shaped its grounds and gardens, and they spent some of the happiest times of their lives there. Their work was guided by their neighbour, Sir Eric Savile. It seemed to me absolutely appropriate that she spent the last weeks of her life there. The present Duke of York and his daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, live in Royal Lodge now. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had been part of my life for as long as I could remember, and as the years passed, she seemed immortal. She had, however, been unwell since Christmas 2001, and I suppose I had been steeling myself for the worst. But back to that March Saturday. It was sunny and bright, and the usual chores, like exercising the dog, had to be undertaken. Then about 11 o'clock the telephone rang. It was Sir Alister Aird, my aunt's private secretary, warning me that the end seemed close. She had been receiving regular visits from our local doctor, Jonathan Holliday, the apothecary to the household at Windsor, and on the morning of her death he was joined by Dr. Richard Thompson, the physician to the Queen. They concluded that she would not last the day. I had just returned from a cruise with some friends down the Chilean coast, and during that time Princess Margaret had died, following a complete breakdown in her health. She had her third stroke on the 8th of February and developed cardiac problems. A few days before this she had told an old friend that she felt so ill that she longed to join her father, King George VI. My elder daughter, Annabel, had telephoned me on board the ship to break that sad news. Queen Elizabeth, although very frail, had bravely insisted on coming down from Sandringham, where she had been staying since Christmas, for her younger daughter's funeral in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. After the funeral she returned home to Royal Lodge and did not leave it again. I felt so sad about Margaret, but perhaps more for Queen Elizabeth than for anyone else. It is unnatural for a mother to suffer the death of a child, of whatever age, and it compounds the grief. Margaret, the Queen, and I had grown up together, and when young, Margaret had such great promise, beauty, intelligence, and huge charm. It seemed a life unfulfilled in so many ways. In childhood and when she was growing up, she was very indulged, especially by her father. If she did misbehave, she invariably diffused the situation by making everyone laugh, so that the misdemeanour was forgotten, if not forgiven. It was hard to resist her, but she did have the most awful bad luck with men. However, the Almighty usually gets the right people to be born first. I arrived home at the garden house on the 3rd of March and found that my aunt was still entertaining visitors. On the 5th of March she hosted a lawn meet and lunch for the Eton Beagles, and then held her usual house party for the Sandown Park Grand Military Race meeting, but she weakened further in the week before Easter, which that year fell on the 31st of March. Since 1991 I had been a woman of the bedchamber to my aunt, a mix of lady-in-waiting and companion, and in her final weeks I went to Royal Lodge every day, usually around 11 or 12, and had lunch with her, the meal being set on a card table in the drawing-room. I tried to amuse her with snippets of news that might interest her. It was difficult to get her to eat much. About all she could usually manage was a cup of soup, although her chef, her page, and I spent a lot of time trying to think of dishes that might tempt her. But it was wonderful to see her every day, and I would take her little bunches of early daffodils and primroses, any flower that was really sweet-smelling. I loved her so much, and I liked to think that she regarded me as her third daughter, once paying me the compliment of introducing me as such to a visiting Scandinavian monarch. The days passed in this fashion until that telephone call. As I arrived at Royal Lodge, I saw that the Queen's car was there. I went straight to my aunt's bedroom and found her sitting in her armchair. The Queen was beside her, wearing riding clothes. She had been alerted while riding in the park, her groom always carrying a radio link to the castle. The nurse from the local surgery and my aunt's dresser, or royal household speak for lady's maid, were also there. My aunt's eyes were shut, and thereafter she did not open them or speak another word. The doctors came and went, but the nurse, the dresser, and I stayed throughout. John Ovenden, the parish priest of the Royal Chapel, Windsor Great Park, arrived and went straight into Queen Elizabeth's bedroom. He knelt by my aunt's chair, holding her hand and praying quietly. He also recited a Highland lament. I am going now into the sleep. He later told me that he was sure she knew what was happening because she squeezed his hand. She was 101, such a very great age. She had arrived in the time of horse-drawn carriages and was leaving it, having seen men walking on the moon. After a while I was persuaded to take a break and went for a walk in the garden. When I came back, she had been put to bed. She looked so peaceful. At her bedside was the Queen, accompanied by Princess Margaret's children, David Linley and Sarah Chatto. John Ovenden also came back, and we all stood round the bed when he said the prayer. Now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. We all had tears in our eyes, and to this day I cannot hear that being said without wanting to cry. Queen Elizabeth died at 3:15 in the afternoon on the 30th of March, 2002. She just slipped away, and her death certificate said that the cause of death was extreme old age. I returned home soon after, thinking that it was strangely significant that she had died on Easter Saturday, the day before the resurrection. It had been a long and emotional, exhausting day, and I was so touched when David Linley telephoned to say that the Queen would like me to spend the night at the castle. That evening passed in rather a blur. We had dinner and talked about more or less normal things. We went to bed quite early, and next morning we attended communion in the castle chapel. Later I went to matins in the park chapel, and then drove over to Royal Lodge to make sure all was well with the staff. The dresser asked me if I would like to see my aunt. She looked lovely and almost younger, death having wiped the lines away. I knelt by her bed and said a prayer for her. Then I stood up and gave her my final curtsey. Later, I was deputed to register my aunt's death at the Windsor Registrar's office. I was shown into the room of a rather fierce-looking lady, and we went through the formalities while she ticked the relevant boxes. At a certain point, she fixed me with a beady eye and asked, "Right, what was the husband's occupation?" It seemed a superfluous question. However, after a second's hesitation, I answered, "King." I think Queen Elizabeth might have found that almost amusing. Chapter 2. Upstairs and Downstairs. It seems strange that I once lived in what would turn out to be the last days of a long-lost world of seemingly unassailable privilege, although when it is happening it all seems perfectly normal, especially to a small child as I was. The First World War signalled the threatening clouds, and the death throes had done their deed by the end of the Second World War. In the year of my birth, 1925, the Charleston hit town, and 12 months later the general strike generated a class war that almost split Britain. The TUC had called out the workers, but the impact did not reach the middle of Scotland. My mother was still receiving the cook every morning to discuss the day's menus. The staff ate in 2 separate dining rooms, one for the senior members, such as the butler, housekeeper, lady's maid, and the head housemaid. If there were visiting valets or ladies' maids, they were included. All the other staff ate together in another room, as in the television series Downton Abbey. Before the war, in many grand houses, lady guests would be expected to change clothes 3 times a day, from morning dress to afternoon dress, and finally long evening dress, with decorations and tiaras. The housemaids had to conform as well, wearing some sort of white overall outfit in the mornings, when all the heavy cleaning was done, and black dresses with little white aprons, rather like the uniform once worn by the waitresses in Lyons' corner houses. They were called nippies, in the afternoon and evening. When Queen Mary came to stay with my family, I was given strict instructions by my mother on the required protocol. This entailed kissing her on the cheek, followed by kissing her hand, and then curtsying. Of course I muddled it up, getting it all in the wrong order, finally rising from my obeisance to biff Her Majesty under the chin with the top of my head as her face leant forward to receive a kiss, which I had forgotten. Luckily, this misadventure did not ruffle the calm of the grand old lady. Later in the same year, King George II of Greece arrived, and I curtsied deeply to his imposing equerry and shook hands firmly with the king. How was I to know which was which? There were many other, more light-hearted family occasions when my aunt, the Duchess of York, and her husband, with the 2 princesses, visited us. They played some pretty odd and boisterous games, with distinguished visitors rolling round on the ground, being beaten round the head with cushions, or with newspapers which had been folded into batons, playing the game known as "Are you there, Moriarty?" We 3 girls were surprised at the curious goings-on of the grown-ups. Cocooned in the nursery, I, of course, knew nothing about the social convulsions gripping the country, and neither did my first cousin, Princess Elizabeth, who was born a year after I was, in 1926, that tumultuous strike year, just 13 days before the mass walkouts started. I learned very much later that her father, then Duke of York, and after the abdication of King Edward VIII, King George VI, was intensely worried about the crisis and frustrated because his position prevented him from offering any advice, despite his knowledge of industrial affairs and his deep interest in the welfare of working men and women. He was president of the Industrial Welfare Society, and when asked whether he wanted to take the job on, typically said, "I'll do it, provided there's no damned red carpet about it." His personal contribution to breaking down social barriers was through his camps, at which thousands of boys, aged between 17 and 19, from widely differing backgrounds, mixed, worked, and played together. He came to be known as the Industrial Prince, and sometimes less kindly by his brothers as the Foreman. My father, the 16th Lord Elphinstone, was born in 1869. For some odd reason, I was rather proud that he had come into the world exactly halfway through Queen Victoria's long reign. I love facts that telescope history. For instance, my father's sister had a godmother who was married to one of Napoleon's ADCs, the Comte de Flau, who was the illegitimate son of that great survivor of revolutions, Talleyrand, bishop and turncoat aristocrat, who somehow dodged the guillotine and always managed to end up on the winning side. I have quite lately discovered what I think is a fascinating historical fact. When the Queen visited Normandy recently, she was met with cries of "Vive le Duc!" as if she were the living embodiment of the Duke who invaded us in 1066. My father had been destined for the diplomatic service and was in attendance at the court of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, in St. Petersburg at the turn of the 19th century. I have always been fascinated that I had this tiny, tenuous link with Russia before the revolution, and I remember as a child my father telling me about the opulence of the Russian imperial court, the Fabergé-style brilliance of St. Petersburg's high society, and his glimpses of the imperial family, who, despite the formal grandeur of their official position, in private lived very simply, the children being brought up in a very English, austere way, as befitting the great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. Of course, they were all brutally murdered by the Bolsheviks in July 1918, but years later I was told that during their imprisonment they displayed striking courage in the face of the tragedy of their situation, and the letters, diaries, and memoirs of those who were in contact with them during the last year and a half of their incarceration unanimously attest to this. The Emperor Nicholas at first hoped that his family would be able to leave Russia for exile in Britain, but his cousin King George V was advised by his ministers that there was strong opposition to this proposal among his people, and the offer of a refuge with their British relatives was withdrawn. The best motives of kings and queens are often constrained by realpolitik, but George V continued to seek assurances through the British ambassador in St. Petersburg concerning the safety of the imperial family, and always hoped that they would find safety. He was devastated by their cruel deaths, and in his diary wrote, "May, Queen Mary, and I attended a service at the Russian church in Welbeck Street, in memory of dear Nicky, who I fear was shot last month by the Bolsheviks. We can get no details. It was a foul murder. I was devoted to Nicky, who was the kindest of men, a thorough gentleman who loved his country and his people." A photograph of the Emperor, signed Nicky, is displayed on a side table at Sandringham. In the spring of 1919, the King sent the Royal Navy cruiser Marlborough to the Crimea to rescue the Romanov survivors. There were only a few, and among them was the Tsar's sister, the Grand Duchess Xenia, who spent 40 years in exile in Britain and who Queen Elizabeth liked. I encountered the Grand Duchess in 1940 when she was staying at Craigowen, a house on the Balmoral estate, often used by the royal family for short private visits to avoid opening up the castle. I cannot remember much about her, but indelibly printed in my memory is the image of her severe lady-in-waiting, a Russian Orthodox nun called Mother Martha, who wore black robes and black boots. When Princess Elizabeth, Princess Margaret, and I were in the vicinity of Craigowen, we would break into the Volga boat song, a traditional Russian folk number associated with the peasant barge haulers on the mighty Volga River. I only hope the Grand Duchess never heard us, because we would surely have been on the receiving end of a rocket if we had been reported to higher authority. We thought that the serenade would remind her of her homeland, but looking back I suppose our behaviour was less than sensitive, bearing in mind her tragic experiences during the Revolution. Her son-in-law was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the murderers of that degenerate mystic Rasputin, who had exerted such an unhealthy influence over the Tsarina. Somehow, I never really knew why, a career in the diplomatic corridors of power eluded my father. Instead, he travelled all over the world, big game hunting and exploring. I suppose his philosophy seemed to be, have gun, will travel. He potted grizzly bears in Alaska and Canada, and I grew up with a stuffed 8-foot-high grizzly standing on its hind legs in the hall at Carbery, 10 miles south of Edinburgh, one of our 2 homes in Scotland. I loved every inch of Carbery. but after 1961, when my mother died, my brother John handed it over to the Church of Scotland as a conference centre. They found it too expensive to keep up, and it passed to an organisation called the Friends of Carbery, who run it in a more ecumenical fashion. After the family left, I never returned because I want to remember it as it was, every stick and stone of it. It had been in the ownership of my family since coming to the Elphinstones through marriage. We also had a smaller house in Surrey, Maryland, my father's wedding gift to my mother, and at one time a London house, which my father had to give up in the Depression of the early 1930s because, he said, something happened to Swedish matches, which I suppose was an oblique reference to a failed investment. He had, however, a fascinating life exploring the most remote and wild regions, the Tian Shan Mountains on the Chinese-Russian border, for instance, and he also spent a lot of time in India chasing tigers. When he wasn't doing that, he was shooting duck in Egypt, pheasant, partridge and grouse in Scotland and England. How the Animal Liberation Front would have loved him! He first went to India when he was 25 in 1894 and stayed with the Maharaja of Cooch Behar, who had succeeded to his throne at the tender age of 10 months. I don't know how he got to know His Royal Highness, but in those days the Indian princes regularly flitted between their states, European capitals and places like the French Riviera. He was a frequent visitor to London and moved around in society, and so I suppose they might have met in that way. There were 3 other big game hunting trips in 1895 and 1896 in the foothills of the Himalayas, Bengal and Assam. I have his game book, in which he precisely recorded for the 3 visits a bag of 13 tigers, 3 leopards, 21 rhino, 39 buffalo, 10 bison, 3 python and many deer, pig, quail and peacock. In 1898 he crossed the Atlantic to shoot duck in the south of Mexico, followed by fishing off the west coast of Florida. His greatest adventure was in 1901. He took the Trans-Siberian Railway, alighting on the banks of the River Ob, near the present modern town of Novosibirsk. The road petered out at Birsk, so he took to horseback for the next 300 miles into the mountains. This ride took 20 days and ended at Koshagash, close to the Sino-Russian-Kazakhstan border. My father's companions for this trek were 2 experienced big game hunters, Philip Vanderbilt and Charles Radcliffe, both army captains. They hunted in the Koshagash area for 3 weeks and then headed south for the Tian Shan Mountains. Their explorations took them to Zhejiang in Kazakhstan and to Yinning in China, in the Xinjiang province, southwest and deeper into the mountains. They returned to Yinning in the autumn and started for home. Their expedition lasted for over 6 months to regions almost unknown to Europeans. In 1907, my father and the other 2 men joined the legendary F.C. Selous, whose real-life adventures inspired Rider Haggard, author of King Solomon's Mines, to create the fictional Allan Quatermain in founding the Shikar Club, the Big Game Hunters Association. My father then, more or less, eschewed adventure, but it was another 3 years before he entered into marriage and family life. After he settled down, he became Governor of the Bank of Scotland and Captain-General of the Royal Company of Archers, the Sovereign's bodyguard, north of the border. As Captain-General, he marched behind the coffin at the funeral of King George V in 1936. There was a strong wind, and my father thought the long eagle's feathers in his cap were going to blow away. He lifted his arms to secure them, and his braces snapped. He had to walk 4.5 miles, desperately holding his trousers up with his elbows. That's the kind of story my aunt, Queen Elizabeth, loved. If something could go wrong on a formal occasion, it made her day. My father gave me little or no advice, but I can remember him telling me that the only things in life to be regretted are the things you don't do. That was a wonderfully powerful incentive to have a go at almost anything, and a piece of wisdom I took to heart. I suppose I inherited his passion for exploration and adventure, and I have certainly had some sticky moments, like being arrested in a coup in Bhutan, of which more later.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?